Only the heads of the Shinsengumi knew that the whole story, the activities of the demons, and Heisuke's transformation into a fury. They were also the only ones who knew that Okida's illness had gotten worse. Such an important battle had stirred up the atmosphere in the compound, and for several days they were excited men everywhere, shouting and talking. Moments of silence were few and far between. She felt she would only be in the way if she was wandering around the grounds, so she did her best to stay in her room by herself. When had everything gone so wrong? Why had all of this happened? She turned those questions over and over in her mind, but found no answers.
部屋にいてくれましたか。外に出ていたらさすがに探しには行けませんからよかったです。これはまさに典型。これほどの妙案が思い浮かんではゆっくり寝ていることなどできませんよ。
His eyes glittered with something, and even though he was smiling, she could feel the fingers of dread begin to poke at the base of her spine.
どうです。私の考えを聞いていただけますか。
It didn't really seem like a question, but she nodded anyway.
あなたは鬼です。
The words were sudden and unexpected.
そして鬼たちは戦闘力も生命力も人間よりはるかに強い。それは先日我々を襲撃した鬼たちの力を思い起こすまでもないことです。その強い力を持つ鬼、その鬼に流れる血はやはり人の血よりも強い力を持っているのではないでしょうか。あるいは羅刹の狂気を完全に抑える力があるかもしれません。
She didn't know how the water of life worked, but Sanan's explanation seemed logical, even if it was a bit panic.
自らが羅刹となる前から、そして羅刹となってからも薬についてずっと研究をしてきたのは私です。その私がたどり着いたこの考えが間違っているはずはないでしょう。少なくとも試してみる価値はあるはずです。この仮説が正しいことが証明されれば、それはとても素晴らしいことなのですから。あなたの存在で我々すべて、羅刹隊、いや新選組のすべてを救うことができるのですよ。
Sanan's eyes had grown painfully sharp, and she almost thought she could hear the barest edge of madness to his voice.
さあ。
Calmly and purposefully, he drew his sword from its scabbard. There was no madness or bloodlust to his movements, and that only made them all the more terrifying.
怖がらなくていいですよ。私は何もあなたを殺そうというのではない。ただほんの少し血を分けてもらえるだけで良いのです。
She took a step back, too. Sanan and his sword came closer. He lifted it, and the steel blade shimmered in the light. She closed her eyes.
何やってんだ、三男さん。
ああ、土方くん。ちょうどよかった。君も手伝ってください。
Hijikata walked slowly towards them, his hand drifting near the hilt of his sword. With calm purpose, he stepped between Sanan and her.
邪魔をするんですか。これは我々新選組にとって大きな一歩になるかもしれないんですよ。
もう一度聞く。何やってんだ、三男さん。
タイのために。 羅刹の狂気を抑える方法を探っているんですよ。
そのためにこいつを切るってのか。
殺しはしませんよ。血を分けていただくだけです。
The room was thick with tension, but she sensed no hatred from either Sanan or Hijikata.
多くの羅刹を失いました。羅刹でない一般の大使も同じく、今いる羅刹やこれから増やす羅刹をより有効に活用するには、狂気を抑える術を見出しておくことが必要不可欠です。そして羅刹を活用しなければ、今後の戦いは新選組にとってますます厳しいものとなる。私のしていることはすべて新選組のため。聡明な土方君にはお分かりいただけるでしょう。それでもなお雪村君には一滴の血も流させないと守ってみせるつもりですか。
俺はそういうことを言ってるんじゃねえ。
ほう。
三男さん、総長ともあろう者が大気を破るつもりかい。人はご法度知らねえはずはねえだろ。
ああ、なるほど。しかし雪村君は大使ではありませんが、それでもですか。
大使じゃねえがずっとここにいるんだ。似たようなもんだろうが。
ならば仕方ありませんね。
With that, Sanan sheathed his sword. Hijikata watched him closely, his own hand still near his sword.
今日のところは引き下がりましょう。ですが、私の言ったことも少しは考えておいてください。
考えたって同じに決まってる。なんでこいつを切り刻んで血を取ったりしなきゃいけねえんだ。それに、もし俺が許したって近藤さんが止めるに決まってるだろ。
まったく、近藤さんも土方君も人事だからそうやって反対ばかり唱えるんでしょう。ですが、もう羅刹は私だけではない。平助にとっても降りかかる問題なのですからね。可愛い仲間のためにも少しは真剣に考えてほしいものです。
Those final words cut like a knife, deeper than anything he'd said before.
一ついいかい。
Hijikata's voice was strained, as if he were pulling it up from somewhere deep within his soul.
どうぞ。
三男さんの理屈は正しい。それは昔からずっと変わらないさ。でも三男さん、あんた自分自身が血に飢えてるとかそんなことじゃねえよな。自分が血を口にするためにその正しい孤理屈を並べ立ててるって、そんなくだらねえ話じゃ。
そんなわけはないでしょう。私は常に新選組のことを考えていますよ。では雪村君、また。
He smiled and ducked out of the room. Only after she'd heard his footsteps fade away down the hall did she begin to breathe again.
大丈夫か。
She saw him relax, almost imperceptibly, as he turned to look at her. The bowstring tight tension of the moment before was gone, or at least mostly gone.
礼を言われるようなことじゃない。
There was something she wanted to say to him, a question that had been on her mind for a while. For a moment, she thought perhaps now was the time to ask, but no, she shut her mouth.
なんだ。
Perhaps she was simply afraid of what his answer would be. Perhaps after hearing her question, He would no longer allow her to stay with the Shinsengumi. No, she couldn't stay with them forever. Nothing good would come from avoiding the issue. Best she simply face it. Still, she was afraid to
俺は
ask.
そんなに暇じゃないんだ。話があるならさっさとしろ。
She'd already drawn his attention, and apparently his ire. There was no point in backing out now.
お前は話を聞いていなかったのか。俺は別にお前を守ったわけじゃない。大気を三男さんに守らせただけだ。だいたい三男さんだってお前を殺そうとはしてなかったんだろうが。あいつらは薩長の一味だ。敵が来たら戦って倒すのは当たり前のことだろうが、戦いに命を懸けることもな。
She had to admit, that did seem reasonable.
それに、お前は光道さんの娘だからな。光道さんを探し出すのにお前は必要だ。そんなこと最初から知っていただろう。お前のことを守ると言って預かったんだ。守らねえでどうする。武士に二言はねえ。状況が変わったからって初めの話をコロコロ覆すようなやつは武士じゃねえんだ。
Even she knew that he was only using her father as an excuse. But she had a feeling that if she pointed that out directly, he'd get angry. Still, that he would make excuses like this, and let her stay, and keep her safe. It could only mean that Hijikata and the Shinsengumi had finally accepted her. That thought was like a ray of light, pushing away the doubt she'd felt only moments before. But she needed to be careful not to get too carried away.
おい、黙り込んでどうした。
If they had accepted her, then she wanted to help. She wanted to do something. Then again, what could she possibly do? She couldn't fight. She didn't have any special knowledge, aside from a little secondhand medicine. She was more of a burden than an asset, if she was honest with herself. What was she going to do? Oh. Oh, no. That's not the command. There we go. Stay. She wanted to help, but perhaps it really was best if she simply stayed put. After all, what could she possibly do?
そうだな。それがいいだろう。
She watched his back disappear through the door. She felt she should honor her word and stay in her room for a day, at least. It was awfully dull just to sit there with nothing to do all by herself.
部屋にいたか。
お前がいてくれてよかったぜ。このまま佐野と二人だけはもう飽き飽きだからな。
飽き飽きなのはこっちも一緒だぜ。
話し相手になってもらおうと思ったよ。何しろ話をできる相手がいねえんだ。
悪いな。完全な愚痴なんだ。だから話す相手がいねえんだよ。
そもそも近藤さんや土方さんがいけねえんだ。
いきなり始めちまいやがった。
羅刹体なんてよ。あんなもんをいつまで続けるつもりなんだ。まったくよ。
So Nagakura had something to get off his chest about the Fury Core. Now she understood why they couldn't talk about it with anyone. The people who knew about it were the people they blamed, and it was a secret to everyone else.
ほんと巻き込んですまねえな。
そりゃ俺だって平助に死んでほしいわけじゃねえけどよ。でもだからってあんな方法で生かすなんてのは残酷だと思わねえか。切った張ったをやってるんだ。相手を切ることもありゃ自分が切られちまうことだってある。そんなことはみんな承知の上で腰に大小ぶら下げてんだよ。だからってここはよ、死ぬことも許されねえのかってな。
お前の気持ちもわかるけどよ、ちょっと言い過ぎじゃねえか。羅刹になったやつもお前と同じように何か言いたいことはあるだろうけどな。近藤さんや土方さんだってまあいろいろ考えてやってんじゃねえかな。
なんだ佐野、お前もあの腐った計画に賛成なのか。
Nagakura was getting more and more agitated. It looked as if letting off some steam was about to turn into a full-fledged argument.
んなこと言ってねえだろ。ただ新八よ、ちいと落ち着いた方がいいんじゃねえか。人の火を鳴らしてばっかりいたってあんまりいいことはないからよ。
話になんねえな。
Nagakura leapt up and stormed out through the door, fuming.
悪い、驚かせちまったよな。まああいつも悪いやつじゃないんだ。まあいいやつだからこそいろいろと許せないことが多いんだろうな。
A good man who just couldn't bring himself to agree with something that felt wrong to him. On some level, at least, she knew what that was like.
まあいいやつにとって許せないことが多いってことは、それだけこの新選組がおかしくなってるのかもしんねえな。特に三男さんはな、俺の目から見たって明らかにおかしくなってきてるからな。お前もそう思わねえか。
She swallowed. Yes, she'd seen it all too well. Even the memory of it made her blood run cold. She didn't feel right to tell Harada about it, though, so she tried to shift the conversation to something else.
そうだな。どうって改まって聞かれると困るけどよ。さっき新八が言っていたこともわかる。でもよ、羅刹って言わずに平助のことを考えりゃ、たとえ何になろうとあいつらは俺らの仲間だろ。薬を飲んだ後何度か話したけどよ、別にあいつらは何一つ変わっちゃいない。話して動いて笑って冗談言ってとりあえず生きてりゃ楽しいことはたくさんあるからな。なんだ、おかしなことを言ったか。ああ、生きてりゃ楽しいことはある。だけどあいつらは表向きは死んだことになってるからな。
His voice hadn't changed, but it sounded somehow hollow now.
もう大手を振って外を出歩くことすらできねえ。それに昼間はまともに動けなくなっちまったしな。ましてや 血に狂ったら見境なく人を襲う悪鬼になっちまう。死んだ方がマシって思う時の方が多いのかもしんねえな。
He gave a short bark of dry laughter at how neatly he contradicted himself. So long as you were alive, there was hope. But what could there be for the Furies? Were they even truly alive? She understood at least a little of the helplessness Harada was feeling.
もう生きていないってことにした人間を切り合いのために生かしておく。あいつらは切り合いのためだけに存在してるのか、それ以外には価値がないってのか。
What could she possibly have said to that? A thick silence settled over the room, and she glanced over at Harada's profile. She'd always seen him as somewhat aloof, or perhaps carefree was a better word. Separate from worldly cares. It had seemed as if nothing could bring him down. But now, she could see that was only the surface. Far below, in his heart, churned passion, concern, and fear.
シンパチが羨ましいよ。あんな風に怒れる方がまだしもまともってもんだ。そうかな。
It wasn't like she had anything to support her argument, but it felt right, so she smiled and nodded empathetically.
でも俺はあいつらに何かしてやれるのかな。羅刹になった仲間たちによ、救ってやるなんておこがましいけどよ、何かしてやりてえよな。
They fell silent then, thinking on what they might be able to do. The air grew heavy, and they sat in that room for what seemed like an eternity. The Shinsengumi, once solid, now wavered. What would happen to them? What would happen to the Fury Corps? Men were forced to watch as their friends became the undead monsters known as Furies. Was it any wonder that they found themselves conflicted, or their tempers began to rise? Several days later, the order was given the imperial restoration. The emperor would be restored to power, and his court would once again rule the nation. The position of shogun would be abolished, and Kyoto's military and judiciary commissioner positions would be eliminated. All that the Shinsengumi had fought for and believed in was falling to pieces. And seeing as that's chapter 4, we're going to go ahead and cut this one a bit short. And we'll pick it up next time from the beginning of chapter 4.